A man I know once did almost everything the financial world told him to do. He bought the S&P 500. He bought it consistently. He bought it through fear. He bought it through noise. He kept buying from 2000 onward, month after month, doing the dull discipline thing people love to praise in theory and almost never respect in real time. 9 years later, he looked at the result and felt something close to betrayal. He had made progress, yes, but not the kind of progress the story had promised him. After nearly a decade of doing the safe thing, the account had grown by only about $47,000 more than what he had put in 9 years. That is a long time to be responsible and still feel like the future barely moved. What bothered him most was not the number itself. It was the insult hidden inside the number. He had not panicked. He had not day traded. He had not tried to get cute. He had not gone to cash at the bottom. He had done the thing every sensible financial voice tells ordinary people to do, and still, the great machine of compound wealth did not arrive on schedule. That story matters because it exposes one of the most dangerous lies in modern investing. Not that the S&P 500 is bad. The S&P 500 is not bad. It is extraordinary. It represents some of the strongest businesses ever assembled under one index. The lie is more subtle. The lie is that one good asset can automatically serve as a complete retirement system. That is not true. And once you understand why it is not true, the whole architecture of wealth changes in your mind. That is where I want to begin. For most of my life, I have believed in productive ownership. I believe in good businesses. I believe in long-term compounding. I believe that if you can buy durable earning power at a fair price and let time do its work, you can build a formidable life. I still believe that. But age teaches you something the young often do not yet understand. A good asset is not the same thing as a complete plan. The S&P 500 is a good asset. It is not a complete plan. That difference matters more than almost anything in retirement. Because retirement does not fail only when the long-run average return disappoints. Retirement fails when the order of returns attacks you at the wrong moment. That is what most people never learn until the lesson becomes personal. The average return across a long period can look perfectly acceptable in a book. The lived return across a specific decade that happens to sit under your retirement date can be devastating. That is the first mechanism. I call it the sequence trap. The sequence trap is simple enough for a child to understand once an adult finally stops hiding it behind jargon. A portfolio does not experience its average return all at once. It experiences 1 year, then another, then another. And if the bad years come when you are young and still buying aggressively, the damage can eventually be repaired by continued saving, and later growth painful, yes, often survivable. But if the bad years come right as you retire or in the years just after, the portfolio is not merely falling. It is being wounded while you are taking money out of it. That changes everything. A 50% decline when you are 30 and still contributing is not the same event as a 50% decline when you are 65 and funding your grocery bill from the same pool. The spreadsheet that uses one long-term average return to describe both realities is not helping you. It is hiding the only thing that matters, timing. That is why I find the language around the S&P 500 so often dishonest by omission. People talk about staying the course as though the course were one smooth river. It is not. Sometimes the course contains a decade in which the market goes nowhere in aggregate, while your life keeps moving, your body keeps aging, your spending keeps happening, and your patience begins to rot. This is not theory. The period from 2000 to 2010 is one of the cleanest warnings in modern investing. The S&P 500 across that decade delivered a total return that was roughly negative in real terms of lived emotional experience, and essentially flat to negative in headline terms depending on the exact measure used. The annualized return was about negative 0.95% over an entire decade. An entire decade, Fay Felicite, Fay turned 59, file 0 Fay, and that ugly decade was not one clean downward slide. It was a psychological torture chamber. First the dot-com collapse, then the recovery, then the financial crisis, 2 major cuts into wealth inside 8 years. If you were retired or near retirement at the wrong point in that sequence, the pain was not abstract. It was structural. You could follow the rules, own the celebrated index, hold on, and still lose a decade of real forward motion. This is what ordinary investors are not told clearly enough. Average return is a historical comfort blanket. Sequence of return is the lived battlefield. And once you see that, one thing becomes painfully obvious. Owning only the S&P 500 may be one of the most dangerous, responsible things a person can do if he mistakes a strong engine for an entire vehicle. Now let me say something else that will make people uncomfortable. The danger is not just historical. It is contemporary. No one knows whether a crash is coming tomorrow, next year, or 3 years from now. I have no interest in pretending otherwise. Prophecy is a low form of finance, but valuation, concentration, and mood still matter. And right now, the U.S. market is expensive, highly concentrated, and saturated with technological excitement in a way that should make any serious allocator colder, not warmer. AI hype is everywhere. Megacap dominance has been doing a tremendous amount of the emotional and mathematical lifting. The broad index looks diversified to the casual saver. But the LIV performance has been increasingly shaped by a relatively narrow set of dominant firms. That is not automatically a reason to panic. It is a reason to stop pretending that buying the SP 500 is the same thing as buying a finished retirement architecture. This is the second mechanism. I call it concentration disguised as simplicity. People love the SP 500 because it feels simple, rational, adult, clean. Buy the index. Do not overthink it. Own America. Let the market work. Fine. But simplicity can hide fragility when it becomes ideological. If one region, one market, one valuation regime, and one narrow set of dominant companies increasingly determine the emotional and financial fate of the whole portfolio, then what looked like elegant minimalism may really be unrecognized concentration. This is why I do not want a portfolio that depends on one story being permanently true. America will always be the center. U.S. valuations will always deserve a premium. Big technology will always justify its dominance. Capital markets will always reward the same leadership structure. Nothing in history says that is how cycles work. History says concentration works brilliantly until it does not. Then diversification suddenly stops looking boring and starts looking like civilization. That is why I think in pillars, not products. A product is a tool, a pillar is a job, that difference changes everything. Most people shop for ETFs the wrong way. They compare performance tables, expense ratios, past year returns, maybe a few holdings, and then pick what flatters their current bias. That is like assembling a house by buying only the prettiest bricks. Bricks are not the house. Structure is the house. So if I were building what I would call a fortress portfolio for an ordinary investor who understands the danger of the sequence trap, I would begin by asking a different question. What jobs must this portfolio perform if it is going to survive not only average conditions but also ugly sequences? That is the right question. And once you ask it, the whole portfolio stops looking like one giant bag of hope. Now each section has work to do. One section must be bedrock. One section must create cash flow. One section must defend against monetary damage and panic. One section must protect against American overconcentration. One section must still give you exposure to the future so the portfolio does not become a museum of caution. That is how I think about it. Not one dream, 5 non-overlapping jobs. Let us begin with the first pillar, the bedrock. This is still American equity. I am not telling you to abandon the United States. That would be childish. The United States still contains some of the most productive businesses on earth, the deepest capital markets, an extraordinary innovation engine, and a legal, financial structure that remains vastly important to global wealth. What I am telling you is to stop worshiping one slice of American equity as though it were the whole map. For bedrock, I want broad exposure, VTI, if I want the total U.S. market, VO if I want the classic SP 500, VT if I want the whole world in one blunt instrument. Each of those can serve the foundational job depending on how I want to express the bedrock layer. But the principle is the same. This is not the exciting part of the portfolio. This is the deep floor. This is where I still participate in the productive engine of large-scale capitalism. That matters, because the answer to concentration is not nihilism. It is layered ownership. A lot of people, after learning one criticism of the SP 500, overreact and begin hunting novelty. That is not 10 billion. It just should not stand alone pretending to be the whole fortress. This is the third mechanism, I call it, keeping the engine but firing the religion. You can still respect the SP 500. You just do not need to treat it as theology. Once the bedrock is set, the second pillar becomes crucial, cash flow. One of the quiet weaknesses of a pure growth portfolio is that your wealth exists mainly in unrealized appreciation until you sell. That feels fine in bull markets. In fact, it feels magnificent. The account rises, your confidence rises, and you begin confusing a favorable environment with a sound system. Then the market falls, and suddenly the only way to extract spending money is to sell shrinking claims at the exact moment you least want to part with them. That is the cruelty of a pure appreciation model. It works beautifully until it collides with life. Dividend, Risk-oriented ETFs change the feel of a portfolio because they create internal cash production, even when price appreciation is flat, weak, or psychologically painful. CAG is the obvious example. Strong dividend history, quality screens, real cash distributions. VIG is another, with a slightly different emphasis on companies that have raised dividends consistently. DGRO sits somewhere in between. These are not magic funds, they are cash flow machines. That distinction matters. A retiree living entirely by selling SP 500 shares in a bad year experiences a very different kind of stress from a retiree whose portfolio is generating actual distributions each quarter from companies with strong cash flow and durable balance sheets. This is the fourth mechanism. I call it internal income versus forced liquidation. You only truly understand risk when the market is down and you still need to eat. At that moment, it becomes very clear whether your system generates any internal cash or whether it expects you to amputate pieces of the future to survive the present. Dividend ETFs are not perfect. They can still fall. They can still disappoint. They are not immune to market pain. But they add an internal rhythm to the portfolio that a pure growth structure often lacks. And that rhythm matters enormously in flat decades, lost decades, and early retirement years when the emotional burden of selling at a bad time can destroy discipline. Now let us go to the third pillar, the shield. This is where many investors become embarrassed because they think every serious portfolio must always be elegant, modern, and fully productive. Gold irritates them because gold does not do anything. That is exactly why it belongs in the conversation. Gold is not a growth asset. Gold is not a business. Gold is not there to make you intellectually proud. Gold is there because governments print money, debt grows, central banks improvise, crises reprice, trust and paper systems periodically remind the world that monetary promises are only as disciplined as the institutions issuing them. That is why central banks still hold gold, not because they are sentimental, because gold performs one job paper cannot perform quite the same way. It is monetary insurance against the abuse of monetary flexibility. I do not need a large amount of it. But 10% is enough for the roll, but I want the roll that is the point. The shield is there for the years when everything correlated to growth is being repriced together, when inflation is stealing in the background, when the currency unit itself is no longer a comforting measuring stick, or when panic suddenly makes people remember the value of what cannot be printed. This is the fifth mechanism. I call it owning one thing the committee cannot create. Skoll, Iowa, U, whatever clean low. Cost physical exposure you prefer. The exact instrument matters less than the job. The job is not to impress the return chart in a year when technology runs wild. The job is to be the thing in the fortress that responds differently when monetary trust itself becomes part of the problem. A shield is boring in sunshine. That is what makes it a shield. Now we come to the fourth pillar, the escape hatch. This one makes Americans especially uncomfortable because American investors, like most people, mistake recent dominance for permanent law. The United States has been exceptional in capital markets for a long time now. That does not mean the valuation spread will remain permanent, nor does it mean other regions have permanently lost the capacity to outperform over a meaningful stretch. This is where international exposure matters, VEXUS. If I want the whole non-U.S. universe, VA if I want developed markets without emerging market complications, VOUA if I want a more aggressive expression of emerging market demographic and industrial growth. The exact instrument matters less than the principle. I do not want my financial future fully trapped inside one country's valuation regime. This is not anti-American. It is anti-naivete. Japan once looked unassailable. It then gave investors a lesson in how long domination can decay. Emerging markets once dramatically outperformed U.S. stocks during the American lost decade. History is not polite enough to preserve home country bias for our convenience. This is the sixth mechanism. I call it owning another cycle before you need it. International exposure often feels unnecessary until the day it does not. That is how escape hatches work. Nobody praises the exit route while the building is still comfortable. But once the smoke arrives, the existence of another path becomes the whole point. The final pillar is the one most people actually want to talk about, the rocket. Because no one wants a portfolio that only survives. People want some part of the structure still aimed at transformation, still exposed to the next major industrial wave, still capable of accelerating the whole outcome rather than merely smoothing it. Fine, I want that too. but I want it in the correct proportion and with the correct emotional label, 10%, not 50, not everything, 10%. This is where I let the future speak loudly without giving it permission to burn down the house. Semiconductor ETFs like SMH and SOX make sense here because semiconductors sit at the choke point of modern computation, AI build-out, and a huge portion of future productivity infrastructure. QQM is a more tempered version for people who want aggressive technology exposure wrapped inside larger, diversified monopolies that have multiple engines beyond pure semiconductor mania. I do not hate the rocket. I simply insist on giving it the right name. The rocket is dynamite with a purpose. It is there because if the future arrives the way the builders hope, some portion of your portfolio should participate meaningfully. But it is not there to become the whole identity of your wealth. That is how people destroy themselves. They confuse a high upside slice with the whole system. This is the seventh mechanism. I call it contained ambition. Good portfolios must contain some ambition. Otherwise, inflation, longevity, and ordinary compounding demands can make the system too timid to carry a real life. But ambition has to be fenced. Once ambition is no longer fenced, it stops being ambition and becomes intoxication. That is what I like about the five-pillar structure. Every part of the portfolio has a job, and no single job is allowed to impersonate all the others. The bedrock compounds long-term ownership. The cash flow engine reduces dependence on selling. The shield behaves differently when money itself becomes suspect. The escape hatch protects against us, only hubris. The rocket keeps the portfolio exposed to real future upside. Now let me tell you why this whole structure matters more than people realize, because portfolios do not fail only mathematically. They fail psychologically. A brilliant portfolio on paper that causes a real human being to panic, sell, freeze, or abandon the plan in the wrong year is not brilliant. It is simply too fragile for the mind carrying it. That is why I think structure beats maximalism. A 100% SP 500 allocation looks elegant until the wrong decade turns that elegance into emotional violence. Then the investor discovers whether he actually believed in average returns or merely believed in them during good times. This is the eighth mechanism. I call it designing for bad behavior before it happens. Most people pretend they are calmer than they are. Most people think they will stay disciplined until they are shown a chart that attacks not just their wealth but their sense of time. 9 years, 10 years, a decade of doing the right thing and seeing very little for it. That is the kind of experience that breaks people, not because they are stupid, but because they are human. A fortress portfolio is not just built for return. It is built to keep you functional during stretches when a single index religion would make you question the entire enterprise of ownership. That is why I care about it. Now, before people misunderstand me, let me be clear. I am not promising that this structure abolishes bad decades. It does not. No honest portfolio design can eliminate pain. Risk remains, drawdowns remain, mispricing remains, disappointment remains. The future does not sign contracts with retirees. What structure can do is reduce fragility. It can reduce the probability that one sequence, one country, one style, one valuation regime, or one concentrated story destroys your confidence and your progress at the same time. That matters. Because wealth is not built by return alone, it is built by staying in the game long enough for return to matter. If the fortress helps you stay in the game, then it has already done more than a prettier spreadsheet could. Let me say one more thing about the bedrock, because this is where a lot of people get cute and ruin a good idea. You do not need 5 ETFs that all do the same thing. That is not diversification. That is closet confusion. Pick one bedrock expression, VTI, VU, or VT1. Do not build 3 nearly identical foundations and call it sophistication. Sophistication is knowing when 2 things are actually doing different jobs. The same goes for the cash flow pillar. Pick one expression that matches your temperament and tax reality. SAG if you want stronger current income, VIG if you want more growth with a dividend discipline, DGROW if you want a broader middle path. One is enough if you understand why it is there. Same with the shield, same with the escape hatch, same with the rocket. The point of the fortress is not to create clutter. The point is to create clarity. This is the 9th mechanism. I call it role purity. A good portfolio becomes easier to live with when each piece has a clear job and you can explain in one sentence why it exists. If you cannot explain the job, the position usually does not belong. And once the jobs are clear, rebalancing becomes less emotional too. When one pillar surges and another lags, you are not reacting to price alone. You are maintaining architecture. That is a much better relationship with a portfolio. Now let me close in the plainest way I can. The S&P 500 is not the enemy. The trap is thinking it is enough by itself for every investor, every time horizon, every retirement date, every valuation environment, and every human nervous system. That is the trap. Because markets do not pay you for simplicity alone. They pay you for surviving reality. Reality includes lost decades. Reality includes concentration risk. Reality includes inflation. Reality includes country cycles. Reality includes the need for cash flow. Reality includes the need for some exposure to the future without giving the future permission to own all your emotions. Once you accept all that, the Fortress portfolio stops looking complicated and starts looking obvious. Of course you need bedrock, of course you need income, of course you need a shield. Of course you need another cycle outside America, of course you need a measured shot at the future. Those are not exotic ideas. They are what common sense looks like after a person has finally been taught to respect sequence risk instead of average return mythology. And that is the final point I want to leave you with. The market does not care whether you did the responsible thing in the abstract. It cares where the bad years fall relative to your life. That is harsh. It is also liberating because once you understand it, you stop treating a one-index portfolio like moral virtue and start treating your wealth like a system that must be engineered to survive the years when virtue alone would not have been enough. That is a much better way to invest. And if more people understood that earlier, a lot fewer would spend an entire decade doing everything right and still wondering why their future barely moved.